Dear Rector, dear Vice Rector, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a real pleasure to introduce Professor Henrich's lecture, also on behalf of co-nominator Freek van der Velde. Only tomorrow, Professor Henrich will be awarded the KU Leuven Honorary Doctorate, but he was happy to give a lecture already today. Thank you for that. That lecture will be on a theme that has preoccupied him in recent years: our weird psychology and our weird behavior. To be clear, weird is a now widely used acronym and also a very influential acronym that was first coined by Professor Henrich, an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So it's about the psychology of people living in those societies. Professor Henrich is a scholar who likes big ideas and big theories, but he's always very cautious in developing these. This caution goes hand in hand with an absolutely astounding grasp of a great many disciplines and fields. Anyone reading his books and articles will be overwhelmed by his broad knowledge and deep insights. In just a bit over 2 decades, our soon-to-be honorary doctor has published landmark papers in disciplines as diverse as anthropology, archaeology, economics, and psychology. Now you think, well, just in those 4 fields, landmark papers. Now, Henrich's influence does not stop there, evidenced, among other things, by the fact that one nominator of his honorary doctorate is a historical linguist and the other a philosopher of science. Much of Professor Henrich's work is done within the framework of dual inheritance theory, an approach first developed in the 1980s by Rob Boyd, Joseph Henrich's supervisor at UCLA, and Pete Richardson. Dual inheritance theory delves deeply, both mathematically / theoretically and empirically, into the interactions between genes and culture, and sees humans as animals with a very special talent, namely a talent for culture. Now, that talent is special for many reasons, including the fact that it is a talent, a knack that requires individual cultural capacities and capacities for social learning, but it also requires a collective or a group. Culture makes individually weak people collectively strong. It makes not so smart individuals collectively smart. And the collective intelligence makes individual people smart. Besides numerous articles, Joseph Henrich wrote 3 very readable books, suitable both for the specialized expert and the intellectually curious layperson. In the first book, Why Humans Cooperate, not to be confused with Why We Cooperate, co-authored with Natalie Henrich, he explains why and how humans form groups. The second book, The Secret of Our Success, explores how our species was able to become so successful. The short answer to that question, why has Homo sapiens become the dominant species in this world? The short answer is cumulative culture and gene-culture coevolution. But the long answer is a really wild and absorbing intellectual ride, a ride that I can definitely recommend to all of you. In his latest book, you see the cover behind me, and you see the cover behind that cover of The Secret of Our Success. In his latest book, The Weirdest People in the World, Joseph Henrich first argues that people from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies are indeed, or really, or genuinely outliers, psychologically speaking, and then explores how this strange psychology came about, these weird norms, this weird behavior, how it all came about. Again, the answer is one that does not emphasize individual intelligence or foresight, but rather culture, chance, and selection. More in particular, the book argues that the Church's strange sexual taboos, and most importantly, a ban on cousin marriage, changed basically everything, including our psychology. Professor Henrich is currently working on a new book that connects insights from his Weirdest People book with new work he's doing on innovation. And this is also the topic of today's talk. I'm looking forward to hearing him on this most fascinating topic. Please join me in welcoming Harvard's professor, our speaker for today, and soon to be honorary doctor of KU Leuven, Professor Joseph Henrich.
Thanks, Andres. Well, it's great to be with you all today. I've already had some wonderful conversations with new colleagues and people that I'm meeting, so that's been great. Thank you so much for having me. So today what I want to do is I'm going to draw primarily from the weirdest people in the world, but I'm actually going to build on that idea and bring in some of our new work on innovation. And I understand that the three words together in my title kind of provoked people and got them thinking maybe what could be the possible connections between innovation and the medieval church. All right, so my clicker is not working. All right, manual. Okay, first I want to go over the basic claims and arguments that I want to make. So the first thing is what Andre said, which is that a growing body of evidence from all different parts of psychology, economics, and allied disciplines shows that there's substantial and important psychology around the world. Now this is still sort of underplayed, I think. It's still possible to pick up a journal in psychology, read an article, or look at a textbook, and not get the degree to which there's psychological variation in the world, and the degree to which our database is comprised mostly of people from weird societies. So Andre's already described that to you. So you can see some of the variation here just plotted at the country level. So variation around the world in individualism, and the lower plot shows variation around the world in out-group versus in-group trust. So how much you trust strangers versus how much you trust friends and family and people around you. And that gap is what that's trying to measure there. I want to underline the gray on these plots. So that's terra incognito from a psychological point of view. So we don't have data to even plot those information. So there's a lot to do from a psychological front. So there's a substantial variation. It's in the kind of things that psychologists think about, but it also is in the kinds of things that economists care about. So economists divide the world into beliefs and preferences, and what we're finding with new data that wasn't even available to us back in 2010, data from University of Bonn, Ben Anke, Anke Becker, Armand Falk, showing tremendous variation in economic preferences around the world. You can also categorize this as variation in the kinds of things that cognitive sciences care about. So differences in attention, memory, perception, reasoning, decision styles, and decision biases. So the kinds of things you might read about in Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that's actually a book about weird psychology. Those things don't generalize broadly to other, we either don't have the evidence, or when we do have the evidence, they don't generalize. Okay, so the real question that I want to get into, and the real core of the weirdest people in the world, is how do we build theories about why these things vary? It seems to me a proper theory of psychology would include in it theories about psychological variation. So I'm going to be making the case that to understand that, we have to think about how we think, feel, and reason, how that co-varies with our institutions, languages, and technologies. And I'm going to be focusing narrowly on one specific set of institutions, but there's a broader research enterprise here. Okay, and then historically, I'm interested in things like the origins of the commercial revolution, the legal revolution, and the industrial revolution in Europe. So for example, why does Western law have the particular individualistic character it does? And that's going to turn out to go along with an individualistic psychology that looks at the world in particular ways. Now, in the book, I'm particularly interested in, by the end of the book, I'm interested in the Industrial Revolution. So one of the big questions in economics is, why did the Industrial Revolution start, when and where it did? So For those of you who aren't in the know, think about 1750 English Midlands, and it starts to trundle out of the English Midlands and spreads across Europe. And really globalization is the continuation of that process. So this just shows the growth in income per capita in European countries since about 1800. So this massive takeoff. So by the end of the talk, I'm not going to spend too much time on that question. It's my thoughts on that are mostly in the book, but I'm going to look at new data I have where I have innovation data from different parts of Europe, and I'm going to go back to some of the original data that we have for the book, and then try to explain variation in patenting around the world, or in Europe. Okay, so a key feature of psychology, which has long been known about by anthropologists and psychologists, is the individualism complex. So way back in the early 1970s, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz described the Western conception of the self as follows. The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, and more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. So this is a complex of different aspects of psychology. And I think it's an open question as to the degree to which the elements that I'm going to talk about are part of a psychological dimension in the way that psychologists think about it, some underlying dimension that gives rise to these features, or if it's brought together by history, right? Cultural evolution can bring features of psychology together too. So the first part of this is a focus on the self. So people thinking about themselves as attributes and accomplishments and as separate, unitary, and distinct from others, so the atomic view of themselves. An emphasis on guilt versus shame. So guilt is the emotion that you feel when you fail to live up to your own standards. Now those might be socially influenced, but they can also be unique to you and different from others. As opposed to shame, which is about the community, it's contagious to other members of your family. Overconfidence, actually overrating your own abilities seems to be part of the individualism complex, and self-enhancement, that always putting your best foot forward and kind of highlighting your attributes and strengths. So these things all vary, and lots of other things are part of the individualism complex. And so the most individualistic societies in the world are the US, the UK, and Australia are very high on it. Western Europe in general is high on individualism. But just jumping back to the point I made before about psychological variation, 70% of psychological studies are American subjects. So you're sampling from the extreme end of the distribution. 95, 96%, depending on how you count, are still coming from Western societies. So the entire rest of the world is represented by that 5% or so. Okay, now just to give you a sense, and as I kind of surf around in the psychological and other related literatures, we really don't have a good sense of the degree of psychological variation around the world because we're often just missing the data. But some areas where we do know, parts of the iceberg we can see, are the use of intentions and moral judgment. So most people in this room, I suspect, would make a big distinction between somebody who stole something on purpose and stole something by accident. But that requires you to make inferences about the mental states of the actors, which is something that seems to vary a lot across societies, with some places making very little or no distinctions based on intentions. Another thing is analytic versus holistic thinking. So to what degree do you focus on breaking problems down into parts, assigning properties, and then explaining the system based on those properties, versus looking at context and the relationships and how things fit together? So this is another distinction that Dick Nesbitt and his students have made. A non-relational morality. So on one hand, you have a universal morality, often based on harm and care, in which people are thinking about humans as a whole, versus a more parochial morality, where you're focused on in-group loyalty, purity concerns, kind of the good of your own small group. Dispositional thinking is an interesting one. So there's variation in how much emphasis people put on describing individuals by disposition, so trustworthy, loyal, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient. That's the Boy Scout oath. Versus thinking about context and relationships in that. So that comes out in textbooks as the fundamental attribution error, which if you've taken a course in social psychology, you probably learned about the fundamental attribution error, which is the tendency to overuse these dispositions in assigning blame or trying to understand a situation. It turns out not to be so fundamental, and some societies don't really make the error. Cognitive dissonance is another thing you would typically learn about in a social psychology class, where you want to be consistent across contexts. But lots of people aren't bothered by this kind of inconsistency because you're really adapting to the specifics of every context, and who's to say you should be the same across contexts? Trust in strangers varies a lot around the world, as does nepotism. Something like the endowment effect, which is one of these heuristics and biases from that literature. Hunter-gatherers in Tanzania don't have the endowment effect, so it seems to be something that involves more complex societies. Conformity varies, and of course, patience. And I just ran out of room on the slide, so I could keep going. All right, so that's some psychological variation. Now, you've already had the acronym WEIRD coined for you, and I've mentioned that most studies still remain drawing primarily on weird people. Now, we did an update in 2020, so that's the publication at the bottom, led by Corinna Apicella, in which we went back to the data and we reviewed all the data since 2010. And really it allowed us to double down on the basic claims we make, that there's actually even more psychological variation than we thought. More economic preferences vary. More aspects of the things that cognitive psychologists care about vary. Things like personality, there's more and more evidence that the 5-factor model, which psychologists commonly talk about, is probably a product of the complexity of our social and occupational niches. And when anthropologists have studied the smallest scale human societies, they only find 2-factor structure. So that's something that seems to vary a lot. All right. So in a second now, I'm going to begin trying to explain some of this psychological variation. But as I do that, I want to just make some cautions. So the first thing is that it's easy to think about the world in terms of dichotomies, but the variation I'm going to talk about is continuous and multidimensional. So there are historical processes which are going to bring these dimensions together, but they don't have to be together. Analytic thinkers tend to think along linear lines, and so try to suppress your analytic thinking. All right. Yikes. All right. The next thing is that really what I'm describing here is a cultural evolutionary process. So sometimes when people think about cultures, and even the word culture tries to makes it feel static and bounded. But this is cultural evolution, so we're thinking about statistical distributions changing through time. And so this is about how populations exposed to certain kinds of historical forces change their psychology over time. And I'm actually going to be explaining pretty fine-grained variation among Europeans, just looking within countries. So you'll see more of that in a second. And then finally, one of the things I learned when we coined the acronym WEIRD, as soon as you coin an acronym or you come up with a word like weird, people start talking about the negative of it. So they started talking about non-weird peoples. And I was trying to think of a good way to get people to not make that mistake. So suppose I was telling you about goats, and then you came up with non-goats. I don't think describing whales and snakes as non-goats really gives you very much insight into whales and snakes, right? So the opposite of something doesn't necessarily give you insight. So you should think about that, because culture is this n-dimensional space. So knowing a society is non-weird doesn't tell you very much. All right. And then finally, remember that WEIRD is a consciousness-raising device. It's meant to remind researchers and policymakers and others that, to be careful about the populations from which you're generalizing from. Don't try to read a theory into it or anything. I'm going to give you a theory, but it's not in the acronym. Okay, and then the other caution is that, it's good to be a conformist caution, which is that when you hear terms like conformity or individualism, oftentimes there's an inclination to add a value to them or laden them in some way. And so, for example, if I say a population is high on conformity because they do the psychologist's classic Ash test, and they turn out to really want to go along with their peers or the other people in the room. But if you talk to the people there and you ask, well, is it good to be a conformist? People often say, yes, you should be a conformist. You should go along with the rules. We teach our children to conform. Whereas in other places, it's not good to be a conformist, and you would teach your children to be unique. And there's been some interesting work tearing this apart. So just remember that, these words are laden in one place and not laden in another. So, and it often goes along. The idea here is going to be that our psychology is adapting to the worlds we need to navigate. So what's adaptive in one place, it all depends on the details of the institutions and other features of society. All right, let's skip this. Okay, now I'm drawing on the secret of our success because I want to lay out the broad framework that's in the background. So, I'm in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, so I'm thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective. And I want to take into account that we're a type of ape. So you can understand a lot about humans, our interest in status and our kinship, our willingness to help relatives, by recognizing that we're a kind of ape, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But what's interesting about this cultural evolution field is that we also take, rather than accepting the destructive, I think intellectually destructive dichotomy between nature and nurture, or genes and learning, or something like that, genes and culture, the approach is to think of our capacities for learning from others that give rise to culture as adaptations, as things that were built by natural selection to help us navigate the world. So you can see the two boxes on here. One, I'm going to think about features of human minds that reliably develop in young children to allow them to learn social norms and language and all the kinds of things they need to be a competent human. And then, of course, we have other stuff, some of which comes from our primate ancestors, that we'll put in this other box. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But what we can do is, once we've done this, we can add rigor to our science by building formal mathematical models that allow us to make hypotheses about how we should learn from others. And then once we have some ideas about how we should learn from others, we can build models that will explain how and when you get complex technology, when you get ethnic groups, when you get social classes. And these are essentially hypotheses about how these things might have come about. So here I put up some products of cultural evolution. So complex tools, rituals and other practices, social norms and institutions, and languages. So the kind of psychological variation I'm thinking about today is the kind that emerges as individuals and communities try to adapt to the persistence of these institutions and technologies and language. So just to throw out some of the things we know that visual processing, so whether you see a certain illusion, actually depends on the visual world that you have to adapt to as you're growing up. So visual processing varies. Self-regulation depends on the kind of rituals you perform. So devotional rituals seem to be able to build people's self-regulation. Pro-social motivations vary a lot. How we think about numbers. All of us inherited languages that allow us to count without bounds, but lots of human societies count 1, 2, 3, many. And so that, having used that over your time growing up, changes how you think about numbers and quantities. And spatial cognition varies. So that's just a few. Now, one of the things that I try to drive home in both of my more recent books is that culture makes biological changes to our brains, but not genetic changes. So you don't want to be a dualist and try to put one bucket, which is all the biology and stuff, and somehow put culture and learning in another bucket that's somehow abiological. When we learn stuff, for example, when we learn to read, we get a thicker corpus callosum. That's the information highway that connects the left and right hemispheres. We get special circuitry in the left ventral hemisphere. So as reading diffused across Europe in the 16th century, people's brains changed. Not because there were any genetic changes, but because training your mind to read affects your brain. So culture changes our brains. People who take twins, raised in different societies, they have different brains by the end because the brains have adapted to different environments. Okay. Now, I'm interested in the feedback that this has happened over hundreds of thousands of years. But that's the secret of our success, and today we're going to focus on more recent stuff. All right, zooming in on norms and institutions as something that can change people's psychology through these developmental processes. So probably the first and most fundamental of human institutions is the family. And I think it's so fundamental and so powerful because it's anchored in basic features of our evolved psychology. So like other species, we're inclined to be altruistic and cooperative with close relatives. So parents love their children, for example, because of kin psychology. But cultural evolution can harness and extend that. So in lots of societies, the terminology for certain cousins is to call them brothers and sisters. And then you have roles and responsibilities that say you should treat them and behave towards them like brothers and sisters. Like gorillas, we have a pair bonding instinct. Males and females get together for the purposes of raising children. It's a collaboration. Human societies, almost all of them, have evolved social norms to regulate this pair bond, often extending the pair bonds, adding affines by relating the child to the father's side of the family. Lots of interest in building the kinship society. And then finally, like other animals, humans have some inbreeding avoidance. So we avoid sex with brothers and sisters, and that gives us a kind of disgust reaction. But culture can extend that to create incest taboos. And different societies have done this in different ways. Okay, so that gives rise to a variety of kinship structures that anthropologists have documented. But if you're interested in social networks, which some of you might be, it's really rewiring the fundamental connections between people, who you spend time with, who you have obligations to, who you're going to grow up with. All right, now just very broadly, and this is so high level that it might offend some of the anthropologists in the room, but very broadly, we can think about the evolution of human societies from relatively small-scale hunter-gatherer bands before about 12,000 years ago. People had extensive kinship ties, where they tried to build social networks over a broad area. So if a shock hit in one area, they could go to relatives in a different area. But with the origins of food production and agriculture, cultural evolution devised a bunch of different ways to get people to cooperate together in larger groups. And one pathway is this one here that led to unilineal clans, where people had shared ownership, inherited status, and kind of building this tight clan that was very interwoven, ancestor worship. And this then proliferates. How do you get the clans to cooperate? Well, cultural evolution has figured out a bunch of ways. So if you look at the ethnography of Africa and other places, you'll find age sets which connect clans in one way, segmentary lineages which connect clans in another way, or the emergence of chiefdoms. So this is the beginning of hereditary leadership, and that's another way to connect clans. As far as we know, the chiefdom route is the only route that leads to pre-modern states. And that's interesting because it means that pre-modern states were built on a logic of intensive kinship. Think about the bloodline, the importance of bloodlines and lineages and stuff in early states. Now, there's lots of other interesting things that cultural evolution, other pathways here, focused on this one. So, as I just mentioned, intensive kinship is fundamental to pre-modern states. And so it's hard to see a pathway from the organization of pre-modern states to the kinds of secular, impersonal institutions that dominate the modern world. So part of the argument I'm going to make is that the Catholic Church created a pathway to this by basically dismantling this intensive kinship, unwittingly. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to lay out the basic argument in the book. And the thing I'm kind of going to keep my eye on is trying to explain some of the psychological variation that I talked about, the individualism, the analytic thinking, that kind of thing. And I have a first mover in my story, which I've already hinted at. One particular brand of Christianity adopted an extreme set of prescriptions and prohibitions related to marriage and the family that broke some European societies down into monogamous nuclear families, which, as you'll see, is a very rare form of kinship globally. So this altered the kinship system. So Europe, just like everywhere else, had clans, kindreds, cousin marriage, polygyny, all that kind of stuff, and it all gets broken down. And I'm going to make the case, so the green arrows here are going to require psychological evidence, and the red arrows require historical evidence. Now, once the church broke these complex kindreds down into nuclear families, then people needed some other way to serve the functions that families typically do, and we know this from anthropology. So production, distribution, and also things like taking care of you when you're injured, taking care of the old people, orphans, things like that. And so one of the things they did is the first guilds are actually self-help. So this is, think like 900 CE, 1000 CE. The first guilds are self-help organizations. They eventually become occupational guilds. People also that can then migrate as individuals or nuclear families to towns. So charter towns spring up in Europe where you join, or you become a citizen, become a member. And universities appear. There's, of course, the Paris model and the Bologna model, basically a labor union for professors or a labor union for students. And then, monasteries begin spreading. Now, these kinds of organizations are different than clans and tribes and some of the more traditional approaches to grouping, because you can switch. So if you don't like the Cistercians, you can go to the Dominicans, right? Or you don't like one town, you go to, you don't like Ghent, you go to Bruges, that kind of thing. All right. So there's competition. So that means you have to update your rules, and you're trying to make rules that are going to get you the best selection. This leads to rising urbanization. So in 800, Europe is an unurbanized place, so about 1%. By 1200, it passes China at 4%. Sometime after 1500, it passes the Mediterranean area and the Middle East in terms of urbanization. Notably, people have more occupational freedom, so you can master an apprentice with different artisans and tradespeople in a way that you don't see in India or China. This leads to the commercial revolution, the rise of impersonal markets. I present data in the book based on that. And then finally, I'm going to make the case that the change in the social structure and psychology opened the door for Protestantism, a very strange and individualistic religion, representative government, innovation, growth of financial markets, and economic growth. So I'm going to present some data here and give you a sense of how we make that link between families and weird psychology. And then at the end, I'll talk about this, but just focusing on innovation today. All right, I mentioned that these monogamous nuclear families are unusual in global perspective. So this is data from an anthropological database called the Ethnographic Atlas. The anthropologists put it together in the 1960s. And here I have 5 kinship traits. So the first is bilateral descent, and it's the kind of descent you're all familiar with. So you track descent, you track identity through both mom and dad. So you're related to your relatives through both mom and dad. You have relatives on both sides. Most societies don't do that, so only 28% of human societies do that. Cousin marriage, 75% of societies have cousin marriage. In some places, it's the preferred form of marriage. Monogamous marriage is rarer still, so 85% of human societies allow high-status elite males to take additional wives. Nuclear families are even rarer yet. Mostly, there's some more complex, larger organization. And neolocal residence. That's where the bride and the groom set up residence independent of either family. So they set up a new residence. Extremely rare. 95% of societies don't do that. There's over 1,200 societies in this database. Now, if we add these up, you can see that the large bar, that's having 0 of these traits. So over half of human societies in this database have none of these family traits, the ones that most of us are familiar with. If you look at all 5, these are either European descent societies or they're places where the anthropologists kind of arrived late. So if you look at the Philippines, the island of Cebu is one of the things in this 5. And it appears to have, it has all 5 traits, but I went back to the diaries of Antonio Pigafetta, who was with Magellan. And Magellan shows up in Cebu. And he immediately starts complaining about the polygynous marriage and the cousin marriage. And then, of course, the Dominican friars arrive about 60 years after that and put a stop to all that form of kinship. So I think that families are an interesting place to start if you're thinking about organizational forms that will affect our psychology, both because they're the oldest of human institutions, but they're also the first institution that children encounter when they enter the world. It's the first institution that they have to figure out how to navigate. All right. So just to give you a sense of navigating these two kinds of institutions, so I'm going to create this simple binary for the purposes of discussion or of illustration. So in an intensive kin-based institution, most of your relationships are given at birth. So you have all these relatives that you have roles and responsibilities towards. In a world of small monogamous nuclear families, maybe you have some siblings and you got mom and dad, but other than that, you've got to find your own friends, your own business partners, and your own mates. Because of that, in the world of small families, you have to cultivate dispositions and attributes that'll make you interesting, like someone who someone might want to marry or be a business partner of or be a friend to. In the other world, it's really about your relationships. You're going to find a business partner as someone you're interconnected to in the network, because that's what makes someone trustworthy. In that world, you also need to fulfill your roles and obligations. Success is based on fulfilling all those obligations and taking advantage of those privileges. So it's it's fostering 2 different ways of thinking about the world. So in one world, trust is based on embeddedness, being more interconnected, and the other, it's dispositions. So is the person trustworthy, honest? You're looking for a dispositional characteristic. Because in the other world, you could be trustworthy in one context when you have lots of network connections, and dishonest or untrustworthy in another context because you don't have a lot of connections, and so you're not supposed to be trustworthy. All right, one is the world of shame, where you're trying to avoid breaking any of the norms related to your responsibilities. In the other world, you're feeling guilt because you're not cultivating those attributes that will make you do better in this marketplace. So for example, I might feel guilty because I don't go to the gym on a particular day, but my neighbors don't care if I go to the gym, and they won't think badly of my brother if I don't go to the gym, because it's about me and it's about my rule. And, of course, the society thinks, maybe you should go to the gym, but my neighbor doesn't really care, right? But it's totally different in a world of intensive kinship. Okay, in one world, you're cultivating this set of attributes, and in the other world, it's about who your network are and who's your group. All right. So then the question is, when did Europeans get this unusual family structure? So I'm making the case that it was the church's set of prescriptions and prohibitions that really begins in late antiquity. But some folks think that it came about with rising wealth in Europe, that somehow people get wealthy and then they have small families. But just to give you a little bit of introduction to the evidence, you can see the kinship changes in European languages. So if you look at the old versions of the Germanic languages or the Romance languages, they have complex kinship terminology of the kind we find in agricultural societies with languages. The anthropological term for the kinship terminology used in modern European languages of the kind people speak here is Eskimo terminology, which I guess is politically correct, questionable term now. But and it's called that because these hunter-gatherers who live in the Alaskan Arctic have this very simple kinship terminology. So European languages have this unusual kinship terminology that you only see in hunter-gatherers and European populations. It's the one that you're familiar with. English actually has the footprints of the church right in the terminology. So sister-in-law, brother-in-law, father-in-law, I don't know if you've ever wondered what the in-law part is, but it's in canon law. It means you're supposed to think of her as your sister in canon law, which means no sex or marriage. So we see the kinship terminology change soon after in the centuries after the church arrives, and we have things like this. There is one dialect of German that didn't change. It's Yiddish. So the Jewish dialect of German still has the old German terminology from the agricultural societies. All right, when you attend a Catholic wedding or a Protestant wedding, you often hear the preacher say something like this: if anyone here can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. That is actually a holdover. And there's a pregnant pause and people get nervous. And there's a holdover from the Carolingian Empire, where this was put in as part of an incest inquest to make sure that the couple wasn't related at all. And it was a way of doing a last check because you didn't want any incestual relations, which could be out to 6 cousins. So that's part of the church's effort to kind of get rid of all this cousin marriage. So the church eventually gets rid of cousin marriage out to 6 cousins. That's around 1000 CE. And then in the Fourth Lateran Council, it's brought back down to 3rd cousins because elites were exploiting it to kind of attack each other. Polygyny is banned. Of course, I mentioned that polygyny is very common. It was common in Europe. Church also banned sex slaves. It tries to end arranged marriages. Of course, elites kept trying to do arranged marriages, but the church was trying to end that. And the part of the ceremony where the bride says, "I do," was actually an introduction by the church to do a final check. The priest, are you sure? Trying to check to see if this was a forced marriage. And interestingly, other societies, if you look at their marriage ceremony, nobody ever checks with the bride. So this is a novel innovation by the church. The church also discourages corporate ownership, so having people own land. It wants land tied to the individual, and it doesn't want uncles or other cousins to have any claims on that land. And that was actually, it's thought to be by historians and Jack Goody, to be a way of getting rich, because people would give the church land at their deathbed, and so by having these rules that prevented this collateral inheritance, that people could give stuff to the church. And so the church became the largest landowner in Europe through that. Okay, now empirically, so I'm just drawing on historians here and other sources, but I wanted to see if we could put some data to this. So if this case is true, I should be able to show you data that links the medieval church to aspects of intensive kinship, things like cousin marriage or clans, things like that. And I should be able to link that to aspects of our psychology, so individualism, trust in strangers. And of course, if that's true, I should be able to do this. All right. Now to do this, we developed what we call a kinship intensity index. We went to that database I mentioned from anthropology, and we looked at whether societies had clans, and whether they had cousin marriage, whether they had polygyny, and we rolled it into an index. An economist named Ben Anke did a similar thing. and got the same answer. Here you can see a global distribution of intensive kinship societies in the modern world. We take the populations of every country and we can figure out what their index is. We also got actual data on cousin marriages around the globe and also in Europe based on dispensation requests. I'll say more of that in a second. Okay. So I'm going to show you some cross-national analyses just to kind of give you a sense that broadly we can see the variation around the world and it's consistent with the idea that I'm developing here. And then I'm going to spend more time zoomed in on Europe. If people have questions, I can show you the Italian data at the end. Okay, so just broadly around the world, if we take the number of centuries that a population in different countries around the world were underneath the church, that goes from 0 to 1,000 years, you have lower cousin marriage the more centuries your population had under the influence of the Western medieval church. See, it's a pretty strong relationship. I could do the same thing with the kinship intensity index. So here I'm using cousin marriage because it's more intuitive to understand percentages of cousin marriage. Here I have cousin marriage on the horizontal, and so that's the percent cousin marriage, and this is an index of psychology, so it's individualistic impersonal psychology. In the cross-national data, we actually collected 17 different measures of psychology that psychologists at various times had produced. And this is a single principal component. I mean, we can do a principal component or we can just add them up and create an average, but both of those ways work. I could show you all 17 of these and they would all show the same pattern, right? So it's in the science paper if you're curious. So you can see this strong relationship here, more cousin marriage, less individualism and independence. And then finally, the church. More centuries under the church, more of that individualism and impersonal psychology. So this is trust in strangers, analytic thinking, all this kind of thing. Now, whenever we had data on the Eastern Church adopted a kind of weak and less enthusiastic version of what the Western Church did. So they didn't go cousins as far, they didn't enforce it with as much enthusiasm, but we always get a weaker but positive correlation when we look at the Eastern Church across all these different psychological measures, whenever we have data. We don't always have enough data to do it. All right, so that shows the basic broad pattern is consistent around the world. Now, you should, if you're an economist, you're already suspicious of cross-national data. But if you're a non-economist, you might not look at a lot. Everything correlates across nations, so you should be suspicious of cross-national correlations, just as a general rule. So we wanted to get a little more fine-grained. So we built a database of the diffusion of European bishoprics across Europe. So if we have every bishopric, we have a date when it was founded, and then we have a GPS location. And then we can say that the circle, 100-kilometer circle around that bishopric was exposed to the church for however many centuries came after that. And sometimes you'll see the dots will turn gray, and that means that that church is in a piece of territory that has a political power unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, so unfriendly to the Pope. So you'll see that that's relevant for Sicily, it's relevant for southern Spain. It's starting around 500 and it's going to 1500. And so this is the kind of evolution of the spread of bishoprics across Europe. Now using that, we can get our dosage. So I call this, it's the MFP, it's just my little coinage, the marriage and family program, number of centuries that you've been exposed to that. We've also put on here the borders of the Carolingian Empire, 800, Charlemagne, Pepin the Short, and the Iron Curtain, because that potentially is a relevant thing. You'll notice, and so I'm not going to get into the Italian analysis. People tend to think Italy, very Catholic, but northern Italy was under the Carolingian Empire and got a full dose of the marriage and family program. Southern Italy was under different principalities. It was under the Orthodox Church, and it was also under Muslim powers at various parts and times. So it has a whole different history in terms of its exposure to this program. All right, so then we went to the European Social Survey, and we got measures based on these questions of conformity and obedience. So, for example, she wants to avoid doing anything people would say is wrong. And then people say how much they see themselves as like this person on a 0 to 10 scale. Measure for individualism and independence, impersonal fairness, and impersonal trust. So 4 different measures. It's just what was available in the European Social Survey. And what we can do is we have church exposure for 440 regions of Europe, and we hold the country constant. So we only compare regions within the same European country, and then we try to explain people's answers to these questions. And we control for individual demographics, so sex and age squared, income, education. So we hold those constant. We only compare people with a college education with other people with a college education. And what we find is that people from places with a longer exposure to the church showed greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism and independence. Now you might say, well, you should say, well, maybe the church brought along other things, maybe there were institutions or something like that. So we tried to deal with that in various ways. So we always hold religious denomination constant. So we only compare Catholics with Catholics, Protestants with Protestants, and we hold religiosity constant at the individual level. We also have the map of Roman roads for Europe. So we can look at how integrated each place would have been with Rome based on access to the Roman roads. We include various other controls. I think that the most persuasive thing for my taste was when we looked just at the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, and we just analyzed, forget all of Western Europe, let's just look at, we get the same result there. So, okay. Now, I could show you evidence that exposure to the church predicts the frequency of cousin marriage in Europe in the 20th century, but I think these plots are more fun. So this is the percentage of cousin marriage in different parts of Europe. So we have data from Italy, Spain, France, and Turkey in the 20th century. And this is our measure of conformity and obedience. So more cousin marriage, more conformity and obedience. And you'll see we put the data from Turkey in there. All the results hold if we remove Turkey. But I think it's interesting that Turkey is a place with a very different history from Europe, from Italy, Spain, and France. But it falls right where you'd expect it, as soon as you know what the frequency of cousin marriage is. Same with impersonal trust, so more cousin marriage, less impersonal trust. And the others follow the same pattern. So more cousin marriage, less individualism, independence, and less impersonal fairness. Mostly it works within countries, not always. Mostly it works if you just look at each individual country. All right, so that pattern holds. Now we don't have a ton of data, so we have 68 different regions within those places. So that analysis is not as strong as it could be just because of less data. This is one of my favorite analyses. So second generation immigrants. So these are people from all around the world who have come to Europe, had kids, and then the kids take the European Social Survey. I'm using a standard technique from economics now. What we do is we attach the second generation kid who speaks the language fluently, went to the European schools, all that kind of stuff. We attach him to the kinship intensity index of either the country or sometimes the ethnicity of his parents. And then we use that to explain these outcomes. So individuals whose parents came from places with lower kinship intensity indexes or less cousin marriage, so less polygyny, fewer clans, less cousin marriage, show greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism independence. And again, we're only comparing French people with French people, Germans with Germans, Belgians with Belgians. So no national healthcare system, national wealth, or anything like that can matter here. Again, holding constant income and education. And also here we did feelings of being discriminated against, because we worry, maybe some immigrants are more discriminated against than other immigrants, but we try to control for that. And we get basically the same answer. So I won't go through these other than to mention that in some cases we were able to do the following analysis, which was we compare people whose parents came from the same country, but different ethnic groups. So both mom and dad came from the Sudan, but they were different ethnic groups. We compare them on the basis of that. So it even holds constant the country that they come from. Okay, now the basic idea here can be tested in other ways. So I've given you the kind of European test, and there's all kinds of intricacies to European history that historians have tried out on me. My main response to that is to say, okay, well, we went to China and India, and we applied the same basic theory, where now kinship intensity varies due to ecological reasons. So paddy rice agriculture, paddy rice production, has long been thought by anthropologists to encourage strong clans. So in China, and this is discussed in the book, more suitability for paddy rice predicts more clans, and that predicts more holistic thinking, more interdependent self-concepts, and more in-group loyalty. So consistent with the basic theory. In Africa, the economist Augustin Bergeron, he just looked at villages, he looked at people in the city of Kananga who came from villages all scattered throughout the DRC. And he had a map of the ancestral historical locations of Christian missions. And then he looked at the distance between the home village and the historical mission. And then he looked to see if he could use that to explain people's kinship intensity and aspects of their psychology. And he's able to make the same link there. So that's just looking at the DRC. You can't, no story about European elites or any other kind of story is going to explain the DRC. And then finally in the US, when people began to move west in the US, Protestantism had long since taken off the taboos on cousin marriage, so cousin marriage began to reassert itself in some of the US states. And then later US states made laws against cousin marriage. And what Ghosh and his collaborators at the University of British Columbia show is that cousin marriage goes down after the laws hit, and then those places are more urbanized and have higher incomes later on. All right. Okay. So just, so that's basically, there I'm trying to link the church to kinship intensity to aspects of psychology. Now I want to get into why this matters for innovation. And here I'm drawing on this idea that I develop in The Secret of Our Success, is the idea of the collective brain. So when this idea is one of these things that I'm finding, it reappears in different disciplines. So if you look at psychologists who study creativity, will point out that most ideas are recombinations of existing ideas. If you look at historians, famously Usher, he says most ideas are recombinations of different ideas. Economists have mathematical models making the case that most ideas are recombinations. So there seems to be a broad interest in that. Analyses of the US patent database suggest the same thing. If you look at the technology classes, they seem to be recombinations of different ideas. If that's the case, a real driver of innovation is going to be first having a lot of people, or at least a lot of minds working on the problem, a lot of cognitive diversity, meaning that's the raw material, that's the bits and pieces that you could possibly recombine, it's cognitive diversity, and then interconnectedness. You got to have the flow of ideas among diverse minds in order to get the recombinations. So this allows us to make a bunch of predictions about what should lead to faster innovation. Now, I apply this idea to this industrial and scientific revolution in the weirdest people in the world. And one simple one is urbanization. So Europe is going through the roof on urbanization compared to the rest of the world. Cities are always more creative than non-cities, and bigger cities are more creative than smaller cities. And this is, mathematically, this is super linear in the sense that it's as if the same people get more creative when they're put into a larger city because they're producing disproportionately more patents. But Europe also developed some unique institutions that you don't see elsewhere in the world. So, throughout the early modern period, people are being trained as apprentices, and many masters are taking non-family members, unrelated strangers on as apprentices. You don't see that in China and India. And my favorite thing is the journeyman stage. So after you apprentice with a master, maybe you're becoming a clockmaker, you then got to go to another master, and often there was a rule, like the other master had to be far away. So you had to go far away to another master, and then you would work there for a while. And other journeymen would be coming there at the same time. It's kind of like a postdoc, right? But anyway, this is very ripe for the recombination of ideas because the journeyman is carrying the ideas from one master into another master's shop where they can make new baby ideas. That wasn't something you see elsewhere. And of course, universities had a big effect on this. Knowledge societies appear. I review some interesting work linking knowledge societies to the patents in Britain, coffee houses, and literacy. But you got to get the psychology right too. So people have to trust, tolerate, and cooperate with strangers. And the more willing people are to do that, the more of this flow of ideas you can have and collaboration and whatnot. Of course, you have to be nonconformist, willing to break with tradition, those kinds of things. The plot here is just one plot from the book. And what I did is I took every city in Europe and I said, okay, if you're an individual, let's assume you can talk to everybody in your city or town. So that's the size of your collective brain. Now, and then let's weight all the other cities in Europe by how much it costs to travel. But that is changing over time, and mostly it's getting cheaper to travel. So you can see the collective brain in Europe, the average size in different countries, increasing dramatically as cities get bigger and transportation gets cheaper. All right. Okay, so now I just want to get to some of the latest research here as I'm closing up. I wanted to explore this further, and so we got this newly available patent database, and we pulled out all the patents for Europe. So this is patents from 1980 to 2014. Patents are my measure of innovation, so I mean, there's lots of critiques one could make about the use of patents for this, but still widely thought to be a reasonable measure here. Those are my collaborators, 2 postdocs. Okay, so I've been showing you data and trying to explain the origins of aspects of psychology. So I showed you trust, fairness, individualism, and nonconformity. So the first effort is I'm going to use those measures of psychology to predict patents. All right, I'll do that. And I break the patents down into 1,474 different small little subregions of Europe. All right, and the basic result is that the weirder a population, meaning the more trust, fairness, individualism, and nonconformity you see, the more patents per capita. Remember, it's patents per capita, so people are getting more creative for each person, or more likely to patent, let's say. I always hold country constant, so we're only ever comparing Belgians and Belgians. All right, just to give you a sense of the effect size, a 1 standard deviation increase in any of those psychological traits will produce between 1/4 and, well, maybe almost 1/2 a standard deviation increase in patents per capita. What I'm calling the weirder is just the principal component, kind of the best factor that fits those 4 pieces of psychology. I'm just kind of crushing them together. When we crush them together like that to create a weird scale, you get a 0.62 increase in patents per capita for the principal component. So that's a pretty big increase, over 1/2 a standard deviation increase. Okay, this is the ugly regression table that only the economists will understand. So I won't stay here very long, but it's merely showing you that we tried each of the measures of psychology. Each measure of psychology alone, that's the starred numbers here, has an impact on patents, so it's making you more likely to have patents. And then the biggest effect comes from the aggregate thing. And what these yeses here, again, I'm going to get off this slide because I know it's not fun for people who don't understand, is using country fixed effects. And sometimes we even control for small regions within countries, so we're only comparing very tight areas. All right. Oh, yeah, I wanted to mention that we control for population size and the area of it. Okay, now, my story here is that the psychology is co-evolving with the social organization. So we have 2 other measures. We have the percentage of nuclear families in each of these little European regions, and we have the number of Facebook friends that are over 100 kilometers away for each little European region. And what we can do is we can use each of those to explain the patterns, and we find that's the case. So, for example, a standard deviation increase in having faraway Facebook friends increases your patents by about 1/4 of a standard deviation in patents per capita. Nuclear families does just as well. So we use one of those 2. Now, the next trick is we use church exposure, which I've talked about. It's our diffusion of bishoprics measure. We use that to explain weird psychology. Or we can use it to explain the families. So we can do both of those things. And then finally, we can do this and this. And if all that's true, then it would be unhappy if I couldn't also do this. So that's what we do here. So more centuries under the medieval church, more patents per capita for each little part of Europe, holding the country constant, sometimes even holding the small little area of countries constant. Okay, and this is one of those ugly regression tables for the economists. And you can see this, this is 5 different specifications, so there's different ways to do this. And this is the most stringent specification. And so even when we control for those small areas and we control for latitude, longitude, all kinds of geographic factors, we still find that exposure to the medieval church matters today for patents per capita. So what I'm arguing is that the church matters through the channels of the way it reorganized the social organization and aspects of psychology. Okay, now this is, if you're skeptical, now I'm going to start trying to get at the skepticism. Even I couldn't believe this worked. So I still don't know what to make of it. It turns out that the church keeps records of which bishops attend. So we got the attendance records for all of these synods that they were always having all over Europe to get people, to get the bishops on board with, implementing the marriage and family policy, root out all this incest. And so we basically created a scale about whether the bishops in your little bishopric attended the councils, because they didn't always attend. Crucially, these weren't meetings about the incest legislation, about the sort of marriage and family program. There was all kinds of issues being discussed at this, so you can't tell a selection story where bishops didn't go to meetings they didn't want to hear about incest or something, because there would have been all kinds of other issues. So what we find is that over and above the effect of having a bishop, a long-time bishopric in your area, if your bishops tended to go to these legislation, to these synods, then you're even more innovative. Because it meant they came back, they're like, we've got to stamp out all this cousin marriage, we've got to, get people to do deal local residence. So these are the effects we see. We see both the effects. And this is actually driven by many parts of France have the bishoprics arrived early, but apparently they vary a lot in how much their bishops attended. So we're picking up this variation mostly from France. We're differentiating different parts of France, and because France doesn't contribute very much to the other result. Okay. All right. Now, we remain skeptical about our results. So one of the problems with this thing is we have a modern day number and we're attaching it to something deep in history. And people always worry, well, what's going on this, you got this big time difference there. So the only data we could find that would allow us to get at this was a database of famous people. And so we took this big database of famous people in Europe, which covers the whole time span, and we have them in space, and then we sorted them out by whether they were creatives, so artists, authors, inventors, anything like that, or whether they were basically military types, so generals and politicians. And what we show is that after the bishopric arrives, there's a delay, but then there's an increase in creatives. So a century or two after the bishoprics arrives, you get a jump in creatives. You don't get a jump in generals and politicians. So you see the effect, and this anchors us in history, right? We see this happening in the right historical time period. All right. I'll mention that there's a fancy technique that economists use called an instrumental variable regression. We can do that. So we can use the church to predict the psychology and then use the predicted values of the psychology to predict the patterns. There's requirements that in order to make a causal inference from that, to be sure it's causal. I'm not confident that that's the case, but just in case you're curious, the IV works. And for my last trick, the Carolingian Empire. I mentioned that the Carolingian Empire teamed up with the church and to implement the marriage and family program. So places within the Carolingian Empire got a particularly heavy dose of the marriage and family program. So what we did is we looked at the border. So we have a map of Europe and we have the border of the Carolingian Empire. And we thought it would be unfair to just take the whole border. So we looked at every chunk of it, like the ones in Eastern Europe and the one with Italy and then the one in Spain. And we looked at whether the patterns dropped when you get to the edge of the Carolingian border. Now, again, this is one of these things like, I can't believe it worked. Because the border was in 800, but you see a drop in patterns when you get to the edge of the Carolingian border. You decline in patterns, which is what we expect, and we get it in every place. So because it's kind of cool that the Carolingian Empire in Eastern Europe is almost a match to the Iron Curtain. So that wasn't an arbitrary decision that was made. It actually followed the old Carolingian border. Almost. There's like one place in Germany where it doesn't. But then, of course, we'd get it in Italy and Spain and elsewhere. So, okay. So closing points. So the key idea is we shouldn't think of the mind as a digital computer. It's not the case that psychologists are studying the machine part and the anthropologists and sociologists are studying the software. That's not how brains work. Our minds have evolved via genetic evolution to have an ontogeny, to have a way in which they adapt to the world they confront. And that world includes technology, language, and institutions. And so in this talk, I've really focused on the effects of family structure, which I think is an important one. But I think there's going to be lots of other things that explain other aspects of psychology out there besides just family. And to really understand, I mean, one of the policy questions is, people like to transport institutions. So parliament system evolves in the UK, let's put that down in Africa and see what it does. Well, you need a fit between the institutions and psychology, otherwise the institution is going to function differently than the place where it came from because the two co-evolved and they fit together in a particular way. So it's important to understand this fit between psychology and institutions. As I've emphasized in this last part of the talk, subtle features of deep history can matter and explain variation across the landscape. And then finally, I sort of already mentioned this, I just want to emphasize that this picture, like I gave you this picture of Europe, very fine-grained variation within countries, it really dissolves any notion of a centralized group or cultures in the sense of a bounded unit that's stable through time. All right? That's out, everything.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for an enlightening talk. There is, I think, some 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. This includes comments as well, as long as they are debatable, and allow Joe to wrap his head around some of the issues. I already see some hands in my right-hand peripheral view, but anyone is free to comment. There is a walking microphone, and please use it for the people also at home who will be listening and maybe cannot hear you if you don't use the microphone. So Martin, go ahead.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. If it is true that the level of exposure to the Catholic Church and its family and marriage patterns has effects many centuries later, I wonder what light this sheds, according to you, on the current issues relating to migration here in Europe and elsewhere, especially migration from cultures with more tribal, non-individualist norms. Would we also expect that it would take centuries for these people to integrate, for example? Like how robust are these tribal identities, these tribal cultural norms, for example, and how should we think about the prospect of integrating these people in our societies in one generation, in 2 generations? I know it's a politically touchy subject, but I still would like to hear your opinion on that.
So, fortunately, I have a postdoc looking at this, and the General Social Survey in the United States allows us to look at this. And I showed you some of the effects of the second-generation immigrants. But so they allow you to look at first generation, second generation, and third generation. And roughly the effect size of if you're trying to use data from the home country to predict the behavior of first, second, and third generation immigrants goes down by an order of magnitude each generation. So you have, it's 1/10 the size is the effect size. And then 1/10 of the size of that is, sometimes you can still pick it up. We got lots and lots of people. You can pick up the effect size. And then pretty much we don't see anything in the fourth generation. Tiny bit in the third generation, you could just pick it up. So, I mean, that's with US data. And I mean, it's a straightforward, and actually there's evidence to this. It also depends on where they live. So the more that people are dispersed and interacting with the general population, the faster it goes, right? You get a stronger effect if you have an ethnic enclave or something like that where the practices persist for a long time. So assimilation is key. The other feature that's, I think, relevant when thinking about immigration is, as part of this overall enterprise, we've been looking at the US patent database and the effects of immigration on that. And immigration has had a hugely positive effect on American innovation and ingenuity. I mean, you know, Nikola Tesla, I mean, all these guys are coming to America and they're inventing tons of stuff, and they're actually making the Americans more inventive because they're bringing an idea, then you get the idea, then you run with that idea. In 1924, the US basically shut down immigration from Eastern Europe, and you can see it declining in all the patents that was occurring from those populations prior to 1924. So constraining immigration had a negative effect on American patenting in any case. So having said that, the one thing that's really useful here is if you know enough about a place, and I have a graduate student at the LSE who's working on this, you can figure out which migrants need, say, additional Like how long it takes to learn a language, for example. We can say a lot about that now, right? How different is the language from English if you're coming to the US, right? And so people who it's harder for, you provide more support so they can learn the language more quickly, for example.
My question relates to innovation. I noticed that you approximate innovation by the number of patents, but patents really relates to technical innovation, I would guess. And at the same time, we're seeing in the West that we're grappling with a lot of crises, a lot of destruction in different ways, and we don't seem to be able to have the social and political innovation necessary to tackle those. So I was wondering if you see something particular about your theory of weirdness and the church, etc. Is there a difference in how it relates to technological innovation and this other type of innovation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's actually it's a great question because it's something I've been, I'm writing this book on innovation, and I think I see it in, there's some work suggesting that literature is influenced heavily by having this diverse set of ideas. So, people get ideas from experiencing other places, from traveling, from meeting people very different from themselves. So there's a little bit, there's just nothing like the patent database, which gives you the extra juice. There's some evidence to suggest that recipes, for example, pizza comes from, well, there's a fun and interesting story about pizza, but when it gets to New York City, it kind of explodes into a zillion different varieties and then spreads around the world, even though it came from Naples and Mediterranean flatbreads and stuff like that. So it's a case where you have lots of different groups bringing different ingredients and they can recombine them. Institutions are a tough one. It's worth noting, however, that the American system, most people don't know this. So Ben Franklin, I'm from Philadelphia, he's from Philadelphia, we're like Philadelphia buddies. He advocated, and it became part of this system for many elements of the Iroquois system of the league that they had put together, the kind of federated assembly, inspired and influenced the US founding fathers in creating the institution. So they borrowed a bunch of stuff from England and from Europe, but they also borrowed stuff from the Aboriginal populations, particularly the Iroquois. So that's actually a recombination that came from the meeting of diverse peoples. I think the problem with the world is that it's a really hard, humans are not so good at cooperation. It's always been one of our struggles. I'm not sure that it's not an obvious failure of innovation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I actually have two questions. And the first question is, what was the original idea behind stopping the cousin marriage? Because it seems like the outcome is the opposite of what church would need, which is that the countries that had the highest exposure are the least religious.
Right. So great question. So and the church was, people always emphasize the cousin marriage stuff, but the church was actually doing a number of different things with the inheritance system, with being related through both sides of the family. So there's a bunch of pieces to it. I think the first thing to do when you're thinking about this is realize that religions do lots of different things. So, if you think about Islam, Islam limits men to 4 wives, so that's actually limiting the amount of polygyny. And it has a rule of inheritance that says daughters have to inherit half of what the sons inherit. For lots of populations where Islam spread, that was a big change. Daughters inherited nothing. And so Islam said daughters have to inherit half, which caused a change in the marriage system. So the Islamic world is one of the few places where you'll see what anthropologists call patrilateral parallel cousin marriage. And that's, for example, if I were going to get married, I would marry my father's brother's daughter, right? So father-brother is the key lineage, and then those two get married. And that means the land stays in the family. So if it's brothers, they all own the same land, patrilineal land ownership, corporate. So that solves the problem. So in order to abide by this Quranic requirement that daughters inherit half of what sons inherit, they had to change the marriage system that made it more endogamous and built more inward-facing links instead of outward-facing links. So anyways, but that's just one example. Zoroastrianism encourages cousin marriage and even encouraged some brother-sister stuff, at least at the elite levels. So that's going on. I like the example of the Shakers, just to give you the power. So there's this flourishing of religions in the early 19th century in the US, and the Mormons come out of this, but there's a group called the Shakers, which just disappeared into history recently. But their rule was no sex. right? And so they can only grow by in-migration. Just an example that different religious groups come with different ideas, right? And so the church got a bunch of ideas and they believed that God wanted it this way. And one piece of evidence for that is that when plagues would hit, the religious leaders of the era would say, well, it's because of all the incest. And by incest, they didn't mean brother-sister stuff, they meant cousin marriage. And so we've got to stamp out the incest as sort of a public health campaign. If we could get rid of this incest, then God would stop sending plagues, right? You occasionally hear evangelical preachers in the US say something like that.
Thank you. And my second question is, it seems like these days there's a huge emphasis put on cooperation and working together in many projects. However, according to the data that you presented, it seems like the countries that were putting more emphasis on individualism are more successful these days. So what is your opinion on that? Is it good to promote cooperating with others, or we should just stick to being more individualistic?
Yeah, so it's tricky to understand individualism because there's kind of a few different components to it. So let me start with collectivism. So when people say collectivism, that's often thought as highly cooperative. But when you really study collectivist societies in detail, it's cooperative within a defined group. So it could be your country, it could be like some kind of extended family, it could be a clan, but there's definitely outgroups when there's no kind of global collectivism that can be found in history, right? I don't know, maybe some Buddhist monks or something like that. But those guys aside, it's generally abounded, it's a parochial kind of cooperation. Individualism placed the emphasis on the self, and then the groups that individualists form are often these impersonal groups, which have, we share an interest in kayaking. If I were to describe myself, I might say I am a scientist. It doesn't mean I'm going to call on my fellow scientists to help me move or pick me up at the airport, but there's a sense in which we're a group and cooperating in some larger endeavor. So I distinguish interpersonal relationships where we have a long-running bond and whatnot versus impersonal relationships, where if you have impersonal norms, they might say, I'm going to treat you fairly, I'm going to trust you, but that's as far as it goes, right? So there are certain rules about how we have to behave. And what emerged in individualistic societies, in the modern sense, are these rules about impersonal interactions. And so the interpersonal fear sort of shrank, and the impersonal fear sort of grew. Just to elaborate, I mean, this really came home to me when I was doing field work in rural southern Chile. And I was going to all these little stores and trying to buy equipment and things like that. And I noticed they all had different prices. And you could optimize by getting your canned tuna and your rubber at one store and the rubber boots at another store and another. And so I couldn't figure out how they were able to get away with this. And what I realized after a while was that all these people live in this town for their whole lives. So all economic transactions are embedded in all the other social relationships. So I would ask people, why don't you get your brooms at that store? They're cheaper at that store. They'd be like, I hate that guy. Because in high school or something, they did something bad to you, or their daughter did something, who knows. Some complicated story. So it was clear that the prices didn't matter as much as the social relationships. And this is what anthropologists call this, economy being embedded in all these other aspects of social life. It was only me, because I didn't have any social relations, that could be, okay, I'm going to maximize minimize the amount of money that's coming out of my pocket by going around to all these different stores. And so that's a world governed by interpersonal relationships is one where all economic transactions are embedded with all the other transactions. Whereas in the impersonal world, you're partitioning these things.
Thank you for the interesting talk. You make the case in your presentation that church affected the psychology of your people through the regulation of family organization. I was wondering if you also consider other ways in which the presence of the church could affect this psychology, or other theories that you kind of, other hypotheses you tested or consider.
Yeah, so a bunch of different answers to that. So the first is that one of the other lines in my research, which didn't really come up today, is I'm interested in the evolution of religion in general. So over the course, the broad span of human history, thousands of years, so religions have altered in the sense that, for example, gods or the cosmos or something like, depending on which religion you're talking about, became more powerful and more moralizing. So my colleagues and I have argued that this occurred because it allowed larger societies to stay together and to outcompete other societies. And so we do experiments with people all around the world in which we give them opportunities to contribute monies to more distant strangers, co-religionists, and then members of their community. And we look at how much that's predicted by their belief in a punishing God, for example. And we find that people who believe more in a punishing, moralizing God are more willing to cooperate with co-religionists who they don't know, as opposed to local community members. So I think that, religions have evolved in that way. In this case, all the different groups that we might want to talk about already have a powerful moralizing God doing that work. So in order to study this, we took advantage of variation that we found around the world. And then, as I mentioned, we held religiosity constant and denomination constant to kind of deal with some of those things. So that's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis for the specific data I talked about is the Roman institutions hypothesis. And for that, we can do a couple things, but one is we put in the Roman roads, and two is looking at other places in the world, like, for example, the Eastern Church continued until 1453, when Istanbul, or when Constantinople became Istanbul. And so that provides another access, because that had Roman institutions longer than anywhere else. But that doesn't look like what happened in Northern Europe, which Rome falls and it doesn't have the same powerful Roman institutions that continued for a long time in the East. So that's another hypothesis. Can you think of any we should be looking at?
A couple of questions in the front as well,
Okay.
but yeah, let's keep the microphone like this now. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting talk. So you had that beautiful graph of the tight correlation with the patents and the exposure to the church. So the reading that you gave of that, of course, is that the church made people weird, and one part of weirdness is innovativeness, and then that results in patents. Of course, another possibility would be that, well, churches were able to be established in more innovative, culturally innovative areas, such that the innovativeness preceded the church. And I'm wondering if you've looked into the establishment of the church in different parts of Europe and the degrees of resistance, and whether that correlates at all with some of these factors.
Yeah, two immediate thoughts on that. So one thing that is probably written in very small writing, we try to control for the initial prosperity of the regions. So we have prosperity in 500 based on historian estimates. So that's one way, initial prosperity. Two, I briefly alluded to the event analysis. So we have our database of creative people through time, and what we see is that after the bishoprics arrives, we get little delay, then we get an uptick in creatives, but not in generals and politicians and stuff. So I think the best way to address your question would be, if you buy the creatives data, then that anchors in history and shows a change.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to have more clarity between some of the teachings of the church, which actually promotes cooperation and not focusing on yourself alone, and individualism. Can you explain or elaborate more on that, please?
So your question is that you're suggesting that Christianity and the church should have promoted less individualism based on the explicit teachings, but we see individualism anyway. Is that the question? Okay. Well, I don't know. That's a good question. So, I could just say that the importance of the family structure that you have to navigate is really more important than whatever the priest is saying up there in Latin. But I think it's also worth thinking about the fact that Christianity is a much bigger thing than what we see in Europe. So we can always use Armenian Christianity, Syrian Christianity, Chaldean Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, Greek, as a kind of comparison. And so we only see this development in Europe, which is one of the ways I've tried to make the case that it's specific to this kind of process I'm talking about. Having said that, there is interesting features of Christianity which are individualistic, in the sense that this notion of individual sin, and people began thinking and internalizing and having interior dialogues about sin. I think that's also related to the individualism thing. You can see the changes in literature where there's more people are saying I and stuff like that.
questions, you go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for a very fascinating talk and also for your efforts to raise awareness on the huge diversity of the mind throughout the years. I here want to jump in with some more evidence from our Center of Social and Cultural Psychology here at KU Leuven that could answer the first question that was raised by Maarten on the immigrants. And then I also have an applied question to you related to that. So over the past decade, we have been studying the acculturation of immigrant minority psychological tendencies, such as the extent to which they experience certain types of emotions that are more or less common in more individualistic, collectivistic cultures, but also self-construals, how much they might change over the years. So, and what we found overall, also in immigrants with backgrounds in Muslim countries such as Turkey and Morocco, is that by the third generation, we almost see no differences anymore in the patterns of emotion themselves between those immigrant minorities and those of the majority cultural groups. But also what we see is a huge individual such that individual minorities who have much more close ties with members of a majority culture are more in tune with the typical patterns of the psychology of the other culture. And also that adopting novel psychological patterns does not mean that you lose the old ones, such that people can really be flexible in which kind of psychological frames they apply to the world. I'm sure you're familiar with this work on cultural frame switching, right? So given all this, and given also your efforts to also stress that we should not essentialize groups, I'm trying to wrap my head around on how we can talk about the important message of your books, also on the historical part and how important that is, in such a way that policymakers and politicians don't take the evidence to, again, essentialize groups and immigrant minorities, now not based on the genes, but based on their historical features of where they come from, and that they, again, forget about all these dynamic processes. So how would you tackle such a thing? How would you talk about it? What words, what language would you use to talk to politicians that your message comes across in a non-essentialist way?
Right. That's a great question. I mean, I've struggled with that because I suffer sometimes from criticisms that seem to read what I'm doing as saying that there are these long, enduring cultural differences that can't be penetrated, even though I'm thinking, I didn't say that. But there is this tendency to kind of reread it. One thing, and I'm always kind of correcting my students, and psychologists do this all the time. So I've stopped using the word cultures because the nounizing it invites it. And, I still use the weird acronym, but I gave you my goats example, right? So I'm trying to, and so I have more cautions built around the weird acronym. So I think, maybe if we just keep kind of tuning the language, because there's this way in which the use of certain nouns, nounifying things, and kind of invites an essentializing tendency. And it's worth emphasizing that, weird people also have a dispositional inclination. So they want to turn dishonest behavior in one situation into dishonesty. So it's worth pointing that out, and the unilineal continuum. So analytic thinkers tend to see things along lines. And I find a lot of times people will say, well, what you're saying is that human history is just one. I'm like, actually, it says the opposite in the book. But there's an immediate way to read it. If you're telling a story and you're highlighting certain things, they just draw a line through that, even though you said, well, some branches go that way, some branches go that way. But yeah, so it's an ongoing challenge, I think.
Last question from here.
Thank you. I will try to be very short and concise. I would like to go back to the beginning of your very interesting lecture, the genes and the culture. And it made me think about what we are reading through biosemiotics in terms of we need to dehumanize the humanities. I'm speaking here now in terms of disciplines and what that could mean for our educational programs. So I would like to have a few of your viewpoints on that. It made me think of what you were saying in the beginning. Do you agree or not?
Let me make sure I understand. So you're concerned about the kind of thinking about the gene culture coevolution, it might be dehumanizing? Or?
No. Let me what they try to say, if I understand it rightly, is you cannot study culture without studying, let's say, biology, the genes. And of course, this would mean very different type of institutionalizing or disciplines, or drawing or education programs. And your idea is very interesting, made me think of that, and I would like to hear from you what is your
no, I'm very radical on that. I think that the structure of the university makes it hard for us to understand humans, because we typically, I mean, everybody who doesn't study humans but does science, we put them in one part of the university, and then we put everybody who does anything with humans in another part of the university. So my department is very strange, because we're the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, and there's like me, but I'm in with the chemists and the physicists and all these other areas. But everybody else who I want to talk to, the economists and the psychologists and stuff, they're all in a different faculty with a different dean. So, you know, it's just not as easy. And for some reason, I think it's because we're dualists, we're like, oh, that's mind stuff, put that over in the mind area. And we put all the sort of body stuff and everything else over in the other area. But of course, you know, there couldn't be more evidence that it's all one big system that's all interconnected in crazy ways. And so that barrier, that dualistic barrier, pervades the institutional structure, it pervades our journals, and so the degree to which we can keep knocking that down, I think, is important. The case that I make at the beginning is you can't even study human genetic evolution without understanding cultural evolution. And I'll give you just one simple example. If you try to explain why human colons are the way they are, we have these unusually short colons compared to all the other primates. It only makes sense once you realize we're the species that started using fire to cook food over 1 million years ago. So for 1 million years, we've been eating cooked food and cooked roots and cooked tubers. So our physiology has genetically changed to deal with the fact that we culturally learn how to make fire and cook and pre-process our food. So our physiology is a product of this gene culture coevolution. We actually have genes that give us resistance to the toxins in smoke, because we've spent so much time hanging around fires that other animals haven't, that they're much more susceptible to campfire smoke than we are. We have some resistance. So those are just some examples that I can kind of go on and on. We can talk about milk and...
Okay, I think this concludes the Q&A. Yeah, let's join each other in the most conformist of way to the adjacent room and have some drinks that are kindly offered by different faculties, actually. Faculty of, what is it, philosophy, my own faculty, and economics. So it's, yeah, it's going to be a lavish buffet. And please thank Joe, Professor Henrich, again for a wonderful talk.
Oh, good. So the bunch of the changes that I talked about actually increases the relevant power. So for example, getting rid of polygamy is huge. Because when you have a polygamous marriage, not only does the wife become one of multiple, but there's a big age gap between husbands and wives. And if you're passionate, but so the church requires a lot of things like husband marriage and arranged marriage are also there's no much in this issue. So kinship stuff I talked about oh, and the other thing is Protestants believe that both men and women have to apply for themselves. So they can make daughters learn how to read. And that lets them educate people. Right. Yep. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. I don't want to overwhelm you because, but I guess this is part of the deal, right?
Part of the deal, yeah.
So it's kind of because you sketched the causal history of queer psychology, but of course any causal history can also be used for prediction control. So say I'm a policymaker in studying social engineering, I could see, or let's say put it as a question: to what extent could I see your work as making the case of, well, engineering or psychology has been done with mild success in the past. All you need to do is do it sustainably over a couple of centuries, and you can really shape kind of statistical distributions of psychological traits quite robustly. So, yeah, to what extent could you read your work?
Yeah, I think one could read it that way. And my defense would be that when I want policymakers to realize when they do something that there's going to be social dynamics and then long-term effects on people's psychology. So, in the same sense that you're saying, well, a politician might want to exploit that, you're suggesting that, but at the same time, they should know that if they decriminalize polygamous marriage, that's going to result in a bunch of social dynamics and a bunch of effects on people's psychology.
Well, I mean, social engineering sounds pejorative.
Right. But in a sense, it's all social engineering. Right? I mean, every time you make a law, you're trying to socially engineer stuff.
Yeah, because
get people to do more of this and less of that.
I mean, that's another kind of more speculative now, but let's say what you will about contemporary morality, but it's not the morality. The moral norms are definitely not the ones promoted by the church. So let's say the individual autonomy is only increasing with regards to kinship and sex. So would your kind of causal story imply that eventually we're going to see some downstream effects of this? Of course, it might be difficult to say what exactly. Would it accentuate new psychology, or would it eventually?
Some trends are towards more individualism, right? Because in some places there's the nuclear family is actually pretty big. Right? Individuals are just they have their social insurance, but that's a continuation of the same trend. It's just that rather than being a nuclear family, now it's just a person.
Yeah, right. It's a further kinship relations, which would have the case for make the case for further accentuating queer psychology.
And also the need for more impersonal institutions, because if you can't rely on a little nuclear family, then you need, every time you get injured, you need someone to pay for it.
But then, on the other hand, you could say the weakening of taboos on incest or polygamy.
Right.
I know, of course, we're getting into controversial terrain.
sure. Okay. Where do you want me to sign? Here where it says signature? Oh, this one? Is that okay? All right. I'll hope you get credit for it. How'd you like the lecture? Hi.
I like how you did
My intentions is that now science
I feel like that there is a lot of work on maladaptation. And you can look at maladaptation relative to genetic fitness. It's just something like social norms, like use neckties, which includes female circumcision as examples. At least theoretically explained by social norms, maladaptive. There's the whole work going all the way back to chapter 8 of the efficiency on prestige running processes. And then there's all the kind of byproduct stuff like religious ideas or general tasting. I mean, the efforts on these guys. Something like that. Well, there's always room for lots of good work, and I agree with you that there has been more emphasis on the adaptive one. And I've been guilty of that as well. It's always been on my list to spend more time on the adaptive stuff, but for a variety of reasons. First, I had to convince people that we could produce adaptations for cultural evolution. Because people tend to think of, so a lot of times people will give me, well, if it's adaptive, that's just rational. Just like regular old adaptive learning, why do we need all this fancy stuff?
Right, yes. Yeah, but I mean, very useful.
Right, so that's a case of adaptation. And have you looked at my Fijian food taboos paper?
Yes.
So that's one where mostly it's about adaptation to the toxin, but I talk about the cases that don't work in it, and I evoke some Sperberrian retractors, I think.
Right, okay, that's really awesome. And yeah, so it's mostly to understand why these non-adaptive traits can be sustained in cultural population versus social. Yeah, so that's mostly one of the things.
Okay.
Also, I published this paper trying to define better cultural information, right? And something that you also tend to define culture in terms of information, riches and forms. So,
Can you send me that paper?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. I'm glad you guys are tackling this.
Just one quick question about your talk. So this notion that the church, medieval church, can produce innovation in some way. I was wondering, what about, well, this medieval church is also anti-innovation. I mean, the teachings of innovation was severely punished. It's like you have to do everything that is by the book, by the Bible, and it's called the Dark Ages for a reason. So is this does this have a role in your model? This aspect of
Well, yeah. So I mean, I don't attend to that too much because I think it's a feature of a lot of complex societies that there's a pressure towards conformity. It's not like ancient China was like, oh yes, do whatever you want, be free.
Right.
So I just think that the change in the family structure just kind of overwhelmed that culture.
Right.
I mean, the Galileo. I mean, Copernicus was trained
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
church. He was at the church.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I found a little bit counterintuitive about the gold motion. That it's like
at least my notion of the medieval church is like they really don't like innovation whatsoever. Whatever contradicts the book, no.
Right. Yeah, so they definitely weren't trying to do this.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
it was just it was because they didn't understand what they were doing. They couldn't foresee all the implications.